All right, good morning, בוקר טוב לכם, שלום רב לכם, באולפן אני אליעזר אפשטיין, ואנחנו עכשיו בשידור חי ב-dudesnude.com ובצ'אטרבייט וביוטיוב. Whatever paradoxes may present themselves in the cultural and psychoanalytic fantasies surrounding children and their sexuality, I mean, okay. Certain branches of queer theory see the smashed ego, that tragic and inevitable condition of children who have sex with adults, in very different ways from the official versions of American ego psychology. One of the major premises of post-structural thinking has been that the ego, described by Freud as a bodily ego, delimits the bourgeois subject in the humanist illusion of self-control. For queer theory, this bourgeois subject is the straight subject, its ego, the straight ego. Shattering the boundaries of that ego through sexual jouissance is a way past the self-protectiveness and xenophobia of the straight subject, of the bourgeois subject. One of the most famous articulations of this for queer theory is Leo Bersani's Is the Rectum a Grave? Here, Bersani argues that only a so-called, or only a, quote, radical disintegration and humiliation of the self can open the subject to desire, to a form of powerlessness in which sexuality can be enjoyed as sexuality qua sexuality. I come to you live from Los Angeles, reading from the book Curiouser on the Queerness of Children by Stephen Broom and Natasha Hurley, editors. Shattering the boundaries of that straight subject ego through sexual jouissance is a way past the self-protectiveness and xenophobia of the bourgeois subject. One of the most famous articulations of this for queer theory is Leo Bersani's Is the Rectum a Grave? Here, Bersani argues that only a, quote, radical disintegration and humiliation of the self can open the subject to desire, to a form of powerlessness in which sexuality can be enjoyed qua sexuality. He concludes the essay by asserting that quote, gay men's obsession with sex never stops representing the internalized phallic male as an infinitely loved object of sacrifice, Male homosexuality advertises the risk of the sexual itself as the risk of self-dismissal, of losing sight of the self. And in doing so, it proposes and dangerously represents jouissance as a mode of ascesis, or ascesis.
Ascesis.
Ascesis. I said it right.
Ascesis.
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 Exactly. Right. Okay. So, male homosexuality advertises the risk of the sexual itself as the risk of self dismissal, of losing sight of the self, and in so doing, it proposes and dangerously represents jouissance as a mode of ascesis. Nor would Bersani deny that privileged jouissance to the child. In The Freudian Body, he suggests that the distinguishing feature of infancy would be its susceptibility to the sexual. The polymorphously perverse nature of infantile sexuality would be a function of the child's vulnerability to being shattered into sexuality. For Bersani, masochism, properly understood, serves life. For Bersani, masochism, properly understood, serves life. Bersani's theoretical ruminations offer some way of thinking beyond the straight ego in a way that respects different dynamics for queer children. The possibility of being, quote, shattered into sexuality might help to reconfigure that child in intergenerational relations. Shattering the ego may serve the queer child's life to the degree that it resists the development of the normatively straight ego. But Bersani will not go there. His treatment of masochism and susceptibility becomes problematic in Is the Rectum a Grave? When Bersani gets to the question of sex between adults and children. He is wary of the fantasies that might accompany such practices. For him, fantasy games that enact power, sadomasochism, camp and drag, leather machismo, all proceed from a politicized unconscious of the straight world. Searching for daddy, what those children who seek out sex with adults are presumably up to, is for Bersani a dangerous replication of the Oedipal struggle to please daddy. He contends that the male imagination cannot get past the power struggle unless the ego sacrifices itself on the penis, the male sexual organ, rather than paying homage to the phallus, the signifier of masculine power. But once again, the child is caught coming and going. His, quote, susceptibility to the sexual, unquote, is a mixed blessing. Should he smash his ego on the older man's penis, he risks replicating a phallic subservience to the uppercase F father. Bersani's version of psychoanalysis endorses the pleasure of jouissance in the child as long as those pleasures are not contaminated by adult fantasy life. And so the child who wants sex with an adult is back where he started, with no theoretical pegs to hang his hat on, no homo to go home to. But what if there were a different story to tell about kids, sex, power, and fantasy? Or the same story, but with a different ending? The story we have in our minds is Peter Straub's The Juniper Tree, published in his collection Houses Without Doors. As the title suggests, the juniper tree is a revision of the Grimm brothers' version of a folktale about a child who is dismembered by his mother, but who is miraculously resurrected, whole and joyful at the end of the story. Juniper Tree recounts the childhood experiences of a now adult writer who frequented a movie theater in his youth. As a 7-year-old, he was drawn there by his fixation on the movie idol Alan Ladd and stayed because of a molesting wino named Jimmy. During the daily performances of Ladd's films noir, Jimmy tried to earn the boy's love and trust as a way of keeping open sexual access, but he eventually disappeared, afraid the boy had reported him to the police. The result of this coercion is exactly what we might expect. Confused fear in the child produces an adult narrator who is incapable of emotional depth and happiness. Read heterosexual fulfillment. He is prone to bouts of depression, vomiting, and suicidal thoughts, and at one moment, remembering himself entering the movie theater, he proclaims, "I thought I was having a stroke." Straub has read his Freud, or Freud as the late 20th century remembered him. In psychoanalytic terms, the narrator's ego has been smashed so that the boundaries that would constitute the safe space of identity have dissolved and render the self vulnerable. The powerful adult figure supplants the child's identity with his own, so that at one point in the story, the child looks into the mirror and sees the face of Jimmy instead of his own reflection. Memory, that narrative linked to his childhood experience, disrupts into fragments. So stuck is the narrator in this pedophilic past that his adult life is all but destroyed. He can find his history only in fits and starts, his child within having become the mere strobe effects of a film on a screen. For all of its horror, The Juniper Tree is comforting because it fits precisely with what we all know about children and about the effects of sex with children. But the story is not so sure of the tight narrative that sees the child as by definition devastated. It interposes the narrator's analysis of what happened in the movie theater with a somewhat different category of narrative memory, one that is less symptomatic of the trauma he understands himself to have experienced. There seems to be a difference between the narrator's official recounting of the experience and the actual emotional memories that surround that experience, as if the very telling of the story resurrected the child who lived it rather than pronouncing on the child that adult imagines being there. For example, there is the following line written in the present tense of a remembered now. I am certain of only one thing. Tomorrow, I am going to see my newest, scariest, most interesting friend, Jimmy. And there is this candid admission which seems to contradict the major thrust of the story the narrator wants to tell. Quote, I suddenly realized that part of me was glad to be in this place, the movie theater. And I shocked myself with the knowledge that all morning I had been looking forward to this moment as much as I had been dreading it. Gone is that sense of the future anterior, as we saw earlier in Philippa and Alice, the queer child whose queerness disappears as childhood disappears. This child likes the experience that is meant to terrify him, or at least likes it more than the adult narrator who remembers it. Defense mechanism, we might wonder? Dissociation as a means of handling the horror? Perhaps, but such a slick diagnosis hardly leaves room for those gay men and lesbians, and as this collection shows, they are legion, who got their starts in movie theaters, at church camps, or in locker rooms, initiated into sex by older figures who were not necessarily exploitative or harsh. Clearly, remembered childhood sexual experiences can be traumatic or pleasant. The problem that interests us most here is how to make sense of the child's pleasure without pathologizing it or reducing it to, quote, trauma. If intergenerational desire carries the specter of playing for daddy, such Oedipal hangover doesn't seem to bother our narrator at crucial moments in his story. If intergenerational desire carries the specter of playing for daddy, such Oedipal hangover doesn't seem to bother our narrator at crucial moments in his story. If intergenerational desire carries the specter of playing for daddy, such Oedipal hangover doesn't seem to bother our narrator at crucial moments in his story. Let's remember that what took the child to the movie theater every day was not just the threat of violence should he disappoint Jimmy, but the positive desire to see Alan Ladd films. Ladd is not simply a father figure or ego ideal, he is also the erotically desired object. The boy basks in his beauty, masculinity, and physicality. He wants to have Alan Ladd as much as he wants to be him. Little wonder then that the boy should be so forthcoming with Jimmy, who, quote, looked like Alan Ladd's twin brother. Both have dirty blonde hair, both have a certain handsomeness and the same facial type, and both use the mise en scène of the theater to engage their eros. This erotic triangle takes us some distance to calming Bersani's concerns about the role of fantasized power imbalance in configurations of queer desire. While it gets played out within this erotic triangle takes us some distance to calming Bersani's concerns about the role of fantasized power imbalance in configurations of queer desire. I am reading This erotic triangle takes us some distance to calming Bersani's concerns about the role of fantasized power imbalance in configurations of queer desire. While it gets played out within material scenes of power, Jimmy, after all, is committing a crime and the boy will grow up to have psychological, quote, problems. It also engages differences in age and power to figure homoerotic pleasure in the boy. And perhaps here is where psychoanalysis may speak with queerness about the vexed realm of trauma. Straub's postmodern tale insists on returning to the child's psyche and teasing out the effects of the same sex erotic experiences in youth. There is a sense of trauma, but trauma, as Freud describes it, where the meaning lies not in the experience, but in the memory, that temporally displaced nexus of narratives that cannot help but pathologize the event. The adult narrator overlays his own remembered experience with another narrative, one that renders him victim. Significantly, that victim narrative is the only one available to him and to us in our culture. We lack the possibility to narrate a pedophilia that will have been benign, let alone benevolent, in the Greek way. And the product of this is another kind of violence done to the narrative child. If we condemn Jimmy the pedophile for trying to destroy the boy in the theater, then we must also condemn the narrator for doing the same thing. To the degree that we remembered that to the degree that the remembered child is the child who liked the sexual contact, the child is killed off. The narrative brought to define him is one of fear, power, abuse, and shame. This particular narrative, this particular narrative produces the terms of trauma as much as it claims to represent them. If Jimmy tried to kill the child, the narrator tries to kill the child within, that agent of queer identifications and desires for whom unequal power relations can be as erotically pleasurable as they are traumatizing and oppressive. Jimmy, the name of this father, capital F father figure, is queerly resonant for the narrator, is jimmied in two dictionary senses of that verb. On the one hand, he is jimmied open so that a crime can be committed against him. In the worst case scenario, his experience in the theater is an assault, an act of psychological and emotional murder. On the other hand, he is jimmied open in the sense that different kinds of entrances and exits are created, passageways that in this story move from disembodied homoerotic fantasy to actual sexual performance. And these passageways of ingress and egress are ultimately the lines of story, the warp and woof of narrative. As the narrator deals with the childhood, as the narrator deals with narrator, narrator, as the narrator deals with childhood sexual experience that he now understands to be traumatic, and understanding that narrative time has created more than reflected, he, Carruth, has shown, is itself an act of storytelling. What is perhaps most unsettling or most promising in the juniper tree is that the smashing of the child's ego and his future, it is, as Leo Bersani and Judith Butler might argue, the opening of the subject into desire, engagement with storytelling. At a conference, the narrator is asked to give advice to someone who wants to be a writer. And his response is something that we can only read as overdetermined. Go to the cause of the smashing of his ego in pedophilic sex. The point is not that if you want to be a writer, you should get yourself molested early in life. The point is that we psychological, emotional, and political stories will arise from childhood sexual engagement.